Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, what if neurodivergence weren't needs to accommodate, but the blueprint for designing better workplaces? What if organisations worked harder to change the narrative around neurodiversity at work, not as a problem to be solved, but as a strength to be recognised and designed for? Today, we're joined by the brilliant Mel Francis, who is committed to making workplaces more human and more effective for all kinds of brains. Mel wants to create a world where we stop seeing inclusion as a bolt-on and start seeing it as a lever for better organisations and workplaces. Mel is a leading figure in neuro-inclusive HR. She's Director of Neurodiversity at Work at Do It Solutions. Mel plays a vital role in helping organisations embrace neurodiverse talent and create truly inclusive workplace cultures. And she supports organisations to embed neuro-inclusive practices throughout the employee lifecycle, from recruitment and onboarding through to performance and progression. Her professional journey into neurodiversity began under the mentorship of Professor Amanda Kirby, a global expert in the field, and led her to become a qualified neurodiversity practitioner. Her work is underpinned by deep personal insight. As a proud mum to a neurodivergent son, Mel's lived experience fuels her passion to drive her meaningful change. Named one of HR Magazine's most influential practitioners just a few weeks ago for 2025, and she's the only one on the list with a core emphasis on neurodiversity in the workplace. Mel is also a chartered fellow of the CIPD as well. So welcome, Mel. It's absolutely lovely to have you join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Welcome, Mel. It's lovely to have you with us, and I share your deep personal connection to neurodiversity as a parent of a neurodiverse teenagers. Really looking forward to exploring this with you a bit more. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about the work that you do, kind of bring it to life for us.
Sure. So as you said, Garen, I'm a fellow of the CIPD, which means that I've had a long career in HR. So I'm an HR professional. I would say the majority of that was as a generalist. I was HRBP. I was HR director. I spent some time in specialising in employee relations, which I think was really critical actually to my HR career, because I feel like that's the red thread that runs through everything that we do, or certainly should be. And also spent some time specialising in employee recognition, which was like the softer side to my years in employee relations, if you like. And then following my son's diagnosis, I wanted to understand his diagnosis. So he was diagnosed with autistic spectrum condition when he was 10, and he's now 17. He's just started his first job, which was another whole other experience, which we might go into when we talk about neuro-inclusive recruitment for sure. But I wanted to learn about him, his diagnosis, and the more I learned about that, the more I realized that we as an HR profession should really be talking about this, because this is all of us. This isn't them. How do we get more of them into our business? What do we do with them? How do we manage them? This is about the fact that we all have a brain, and therefore the very nature of neurodiversity is that we are all neurodiverse, because our brains are brilliantly unique, brilliantly different from each other, and therefore that nature of understanding and really harnessing talent is core to everything that we do within businesses, within life, actually. So I was really passionate about sharing what I knew, and that passion has just grown and grown as I've talked about it more and more.
Thank you. And definition really matters, doesn't it? Because we talk about neurodivergence and we make it sound like it's one kind of homogenous thing, and it's really the opposite of that.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, some people that you speak to think neurodivergence or neurodiversity is autism, or it's ADHD. ADHD and autism continue to be the two conditions that we talk about the most, and they're probably the ones that are being diagnosed the most at the moment. But actually neurodiversity is the fact that we all have different brains. And so at Do It Solutions, we don't deliver training specifically about ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, whatever the particular condition might be. Now, that's not to invalidate any of the diagnoses that individuals might have, but really we're keen to ensure that people understand that neurodiversity is just about having diverse brains. Our neuros are diverse. And so that tends to be the real key narrative that we are speaking about a lot. And also, the language is really changing around this. So already we've talked about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, ADHD, autism. What are those words and phrases? What do they mean? And what might be some of those words and phrases that prevent people from talking about it because they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing? So what we can do collectively is just talk about it. If you're worried that you're going to say the wrong thing, don't worry. I can guarantee someone will correct you if you're getting something wrong. But also, the worst thing you can do is not talk about it because you think you haven't got the right words. It's really important that we just get curious and speak about it.
We talk to leaders and we talk to HR teams. They're often thinking about neurodiversity or neurodivergence as something to accommodate, to kind of work around.
Yes.
What shift needs to happen to really move it to something that we're designing with kind of in a more, I guess, positive approach lens?
Yeah, I think, shifting away from, like you say, something we've got to accommodate is really critical because, as I said, we all have different brains. So neurodiversity is all of us, and neurodivergence is already in your team. So, it's not about how do you create a process that's going to enable you to recruit more. What neurodiversity or neuroinclusion, I should say, should be about is removing barriers. So we've just shared on LinkedIn results from 650 people who took our workplace profiler, the Do It Workplace Profiler, which is a neurodiversity screening tool. And the most common thing that people said that would be most helpful for them in workplaces is to have notes and agendas in advance of meetings, right? So this is like that should just be a given anyway, shouldn't it? But also, that costs nothing. And that's going to have massive benefits for everyone. This isn't just about, putting a bowl of fidget spinners in the middle of the table and going, that's it, that's my neurodiversity stuff done. That's not how this should work. And actually, this is about being neuro-inclusive for all of us, not just looking at, individual accommodations, although, of course, we should be looking at those as well.
That's such a simple thing. And
it really is, isn't it?
It would really make the difference to everybody.
Yeah. And the top 10 list was of similar types of things that just go, well, yeah, of course, that's just a given. But it's good to be reminded that those types of things are going to be super helpful and also that they don't cost anything.
Yeah. And what are some of the other defaults then that you see in organisation life that you'd like to challenge if you could do it?
Really good question. So some of the assumptions that you see are things like, even today, actually, I was reading an article and somebody had referred to neurodiversity and used the analogy with Rain Man, right? Which of course, like generationally, I think we've got a real issue here, right? And it's because, conditions like ADHD and autism were only categorized in the 1980s. So they only first appeared as an actual categorization diagnosis in the 80s. They were created, those diagnoses were created by observing boys. And so when you think about definitions for ADHD and autism, if you think about ADHD, let's start there, you might think about the disruptive boy in the classroom who can't sit still, who is disrupting the class, etc. And that's because that's what the original diagnosis was based on. And it wasn't until we got into the 90s and research continued that we started to realize that the way in which these traits kind of materialized in girls was very different. And so started to shift the diagnosis, and we started to see a shift or an increase in the number of girls being diagnosed. And it went from something like 10 boys to every 1 girl being diagnosed. That was a stark difference to, and it's still not equal, but we're seeing probably 7 to 10 rather than, the stark difference that it was then. And so what that means is that the ways in which we're understanding neurodiversity in the workplace in particular is really changing. And so, moving away from some of those antiquated views of neurodiversity is really important, and understanding and increasing awareness of neurodiversity most broadly is also really important for us too.
The increase in awareness and the increase in diagnosis is a little bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, isn't it?
Yes.
Because some of the backlash on social media around that is really quite challenging.
Huge. Yeah. It's funny because Professor Kirby and I talk about this a lot. There's this notion that suddenly everyone's being diagnosed, or suddenly everyone's got ADHD. And there's actually, and we do laugh about this as well. There's a comedian called Sarah Pascoe, who we were watching a sketch from her, and she says, "Hi, I'm Sarah. I've got ADHD. I know I've got ADHD because my friend Rebecca told me I've got ADHD, because her friend Rebecca has also got ADHD. And basically ADHD is just like a pyramid scheme. We all kind of tell each other that we've got it." And he just kind of, it's actually, you see that playing out massively, because you can go onto TikTok and go through a kind of diagnosis. So you're coming away going, yep, definitely that's me. And that's kind of, it's important for us in HR professions to know this stuff, because you don't have to have a diagnosis in order to be protected under the Equality Act. And there are some great cases that reinforce that and help us to really understand that. So no formal diagnosis is needed in order to be accommodated and to be protected. So the important thing that we as HR professionals then understand is that this is increasing. People can self-identify, so they can be, in that pyramid scheme or on the TikTok, etc., and then be coming to us and saying, I got ADHD, or I've got ADHD traits, I need accommodations. And what we have to do is to explore that and to look and see what we can do to understand what your challenges are, and also understand what your strengths are. The diagnoses around all of the neurodiverse conditions are based on deficit models. So what they're looking at is, are your challenges bad enough? And have you been impacted by them long enough, so since childhood, in order to meet the criteria in order to be diagnosed with the one condition that I am looking at on my list? And that, again, not to invalidate any of those diagnoses, but what it's not doing is looking at the entirety of your brain and your strengths and your challenges, because it might be traits that stereotypically sit with other conditions that you haven't been assessed for. So the most powerful thing we can do as HR professionals is, even if people are coming to us going, I've decided I've got ADHD, or I've been diagnosed with a particular condition, is to understand that individual's strengths and challenges, and then look at that in the context of the workplace, of the job, and determine what accommodations or adjustments might be helpful, and whether they are reasonable in the, under the Equality Act requirements. And sometimes they won't be. Sometimes it will be a case that we just can't meet the requirements or put those accommodations in place to enable you to perform in a way that is going to meet the requirements for the role. And that's tough. And I think as HR professionals, some of us are getting ourselves into a bit of a loop here with, they've told me that they've got ADHD, they've told me they need this thing, and I don't really know where to go with it. So we're just going to keep going until, something happens, some divine intervention or something, I don't know. But there are tools that exist that can really help with this. And we have one at Do It Solutions. We created the Do It Profiler, which is, I referred to earlier, which is really designed to understand, firstly, neurodiverse traits, but I think most importantly, strengths and challenges, and it will give you resources relating to those challenges recommendations for accommodations, and also it will give you a work with me passport to be able to prepare for a really good conversation with whoever you need to speak to, as well as a well-being report, because our brains are not separate from our well-being and our mental health. These are all happening at the same time. So it's really important that we take into account how we're doing too, and how we're feeling and what might be going on at home or at work or in our mood, etc. That would all be impactful too.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I guess in the UK, where a number of our viewers are, it's as you mentioned, it's a protected characteristic. So by law, the employer has an obligation to the employee as well. And I guess one of the things I'm really liking about what you're saying there is to actually, you need to understand the individual as well, because often it's not always a singular diagnosis. It may be ADHD, it may be autism, sort of multiple sort of diagnoses as well. What's the saying? I heard someone say, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. because everyone is so unique and different in their own way, aren't they? So we have to take the time to understand their individual needs.
And I use that phrase all the time, Garen, because that is really important. That you are meeting one person, right? So what is it about them that we need to understand? And then if we put that in the context of our role, in the context of our workplaces, our work environments are shifting and changing. And post-COVID, I remember there were lots of conversations that we were having about how lots of people have been super comfortable at working from home during COVID, and then they were really struggling with coming back to work, like the whole sort of social anxiety of getting on buses and having to travel again and stuff like that. Now, that's really important that we explore that and don't just dismiss it. And it may be that we explore it and say, well, look, this is a, I don't know, call center environment, and we're going to need to have you in the workplace. So, we can't make a reasonable adjustment that says that you can work from home because of the nature of the work that we're doing. But what we can do is have a look at the timings of your shifts, or how we can help you to avoid some of those peak times that might be really troubling, if possible. This isn't always going to be possible, and we have to look at reasonableness. And it was interesting, I was talking to an employment lawyer who gave me this really simple matrix, which says that if something is of high benefit and low cost, then the employment tribunal is really going to have expected you to have implemented that. If it's going to be low benefit and high cost, then they're going to be cool about the fact that you didn't implement it. So again, this sort of unraveling of what's reasonable, what can we do, what should we do, is really important for us to be able to navigate. And also show you're working, right? As anyone that's ever worked with me will have heard me say, 6 steps ahead, when you're stood in front of the employment tribunal, can you prove that you have done everything you possibly could to support this individual on the way through whatever the situation may be? And that's really critical. And being able to show that you've taken all of anything that you possibly could into account, even if you've considered it and discounted it, show that you've done that and show you're working along the way. And then, hopefully you won't be, firstly, hopefully you won't ever be in a tribunal, but secondly, you won't be in a tribunal where you're finding it to be in the favour of the claimant rather than, for you.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback.
A quick check as well, because again, multiple sources. I read it's 1 in 5 people have potentially some form of neurodiverse need. Is that correct?
Yes. So, yeah, Yes,
Please unpack.
I'm going to
Yeah.
take this kind of, it depends where you're pulling the data from, but let's take this as a general census that 1 in 5 is neurodivergent. So, and what that means is if you look at a stereotypical bell curve, in the hump of the bell curve there, you've got 80% of the population who we will call neurotypical. So again, chucking in more terminology around this. So neurotypical means that our brains work in a very similar way, and the world is very neurotypical. It assumes that we can navigate through what is deemed to be a typical way of life, right? So we can follow instructions, we can get ourselves to places on time, we can read, we can write, we can communicate, we can walk, all of these things there in the hump. But of course we know that not all of us are doing that in the same way, because we're all different. So there's our neurodiversity, that our neuros are diverse, our brains are different. But diverging from that neurotypical are 20% of brains. So it means that our brains are working differently. And I would just really emphasize the word differently, because I haven't said better or worse, but differently. And so that's neurodivergence. So someone who's neurodivergent might be, it might be a premier footballer, right? Other people might not be able to kick a ball. Some people might be brilliant linguists. Other might be non-verbal. It's, looking, that divergence is, looking at where it's diverging from the neurotypical. And what, as I said earlier, the diagnostic criteria is really looking in a deficit way. So it's only ever really looking at the things that are diverging in a negative way, not where it's diverging in a really positive way. So you've got like fantastic mathematicians, scientists, all of these kind of brilliant brains that would not have a diagnosis of neurodivergence because the diagnoses don't really cope with the positives way of doing things. But we know that this really plays out. I spent 8 years as HR director at Oxford University's business school, surrounded in Oxford by brilliant brains, right? So neurodivergence was a really core part. And then, we used to talk about lack of common sense, but huge amounts of intelligence. And really, this was neurodivergence at its kind of purest sense. But those diagnoses would not have been in place. And actually, what was really interesting is the ways in which individuals are selected to get places at Oxford and other universities, I'm sure, was not at all neuro-inclusive, because it's looking at, again, can you come in, can you articulate, can you tell me about, the brilliant stuff that you're working on, that you're researching, etc., etc. Well, if you couldn't, you might not have got a place there. And it means that, we're missing out on some brilliant talent because of the ways in which we're selecting. And you can take that and squarely pop that into our workplaces as well, and think about the ways in which we're selecting and how we could be more neuro-inclusive in doing that too.
One of the things when we sort of preparing for it, I thought was really interesting, and you sort of touched on the fact there is very much a deficit orientation in diagnosis, and a lot of that comes from the medical model, doesn't it? Where it is about trying to find and diagnose in that way. But if we're thinking about how we build organizations, then the social model is often more helpful, isn't it? Because the medical model tells us why people can't do things. The social model looks at what we can actually do to create an environment where people might thrive or flourish, or at least survive in the workplace.
Yeah. And actually, what we're also finding is that we need to move more towards skills assessment as well. What are we recruiting for? So, and how can we assess that people are great at that thing? And I think this is going to be even more important actually as we move into, or have moved, with AI taking far more center stage in things like our selection methods. We are going to have to shift to more human interaction and selection rather than AI models, which are invariably increasingly biased. Actually, I was absolutely aghast the other day when I saw a list which came out in one of the newsletters from an HR publication, which said, here are the top 10 AI models that every HR team needs now. And number 2 on this list was an AI hiring tool, it was called. It was a US-based tool, actually, which I think is really critical. We'll talk about that in a second. But it said that the key features of this tool were that they were able to select your candidates based on their ability to interact, on their tone of voice, on their eye movement, etc. Now, what are some of the things that are really tricky, maybe really tricky for some who are neurodivergent? Exactly those things. And then you go, well, that's who is checking that our best talent isn't being sifted out by the AI, having completed the individuals having completed their video interview or whatever. Are we just literally handing those decisions over to AI tools and they're being sifted out at the first opportunity? So I'm really concerned about that. And it means that our human input is even more critical as we're going through those types of things too.
So these are some really important principles, aren't they, for
Yeah.
our audience is kind of OD practitioners and internal, external, maybe HR practitioners. What are some of the principles that we can apply to kind of any project or piece of work we're kind of involved in?
For me, the key principle is, what are the key skills that you're going to need on this project? And looking at selecting individuals to add to your team rather than fit. So, we hear a lot, don't we, about team fit. What does team fit really mean? We know it probably means, oh, I've worked with them before. They're a good person. I know they're good. They'll probably come down the pub on a Thursday and they laugh at my jokes and they're nice people to be around, right? So great, all good. But we're probably missing a trick when we're not thinking about, oh, actually, they've got these skills that we don't have, that, when we do a matrix of what skills and experience we've got in the team, where are we missing and what gaps could we look to fill? Because otherwise we're just kind of looking at cookie cutter versions of ourselves, and therefore we're not getting that divergence in skills, experience, thought processes, etc., into the team. So I think that would probably be the key thing that I would encourage people to do, is to think about hiring or adding people to your team based on skills rather than team fit.
And the other thing I'm thinking is about managers. We'll often talk about the role of managers in these types of things. And
Yeah.
I think for some people, they feel managers feel like increasingly overwhelmed about the number of things they need to think about and take on board. And, for some of them, I guess, neurodivergence might just feel like another thing to.
Yes.
What support can we give to managers to equip them?
Do I think managers have a really tough gig. They really do. They've got to keep their powers above happy. They've got to keep team members happy. And I remember when I was managing a team of 9, and hello, if you're watching, team of 9, I love you all, you're all great, but honestly it was like having 9 extra kids.
That's a lot.
And I don't miss having 9 extra kids. You felt very responsible for everybody, and we are expected as line managers to know everything about everything, and we can't possibly know that. So I think for line managers, let's give you a baseline understanding of what neurodiversity is. Let's also give you the tools so that you can get a sense of who you have in your team, what those skills, those experiences look like, how people prefer to communicate, who doesn't work on a Friday, what the family situation, all of those kind of really important details of individuals within your team, so that you can make some good decisions, and also make good decisions about workload and project team creation, formation, etc. But also that you have good insights into you know, you might want to check in with Mel every Friday because she said that Fridays she finds really overwhelming, or whatever the case may be. You know, you've got extra details as well. So I think that if we can give managers tools to help with that sort of stuff, that's great. But also if we can give them information and education in ways that are very quick, that doesn't require them to go on a whole day's course on stuff, which is why actually we worked at Do It. We worked with a company called 10 to 3, who are a brilliant video training company, and we've created a suite of training videos which are about 3 minutes long each. So 10 to 3 is based on the premise that it's 10 to 3, you've got a meeting at 3, what do you need to know in the next 10 minutes? And so we've got a suite of videos on neurodiversity that give managers specifically information about how they can be more neuro-inclusive. And surely that's enough, right? We don't have to bring them in, sit them down all day to be able to go through the training and tick a box. We want them to be able to have information and be informed to enable them to be good managers for their team.
Just to flip your question on its head a little. So
Yeah.
a lot of people don't get a diagnosis until later in life.
Yeah, or at all.
Or at all, absolutely. And so they go through life. In particular, we do see a number of employees that have a sense that their manager might have some neurodivergent needs, but won't be diagnosed. It won't be out in the open. And yet often those relationships they're stressful anyway because they're in a difficult context. It's fast paced now. What strategies are available for sort of team members that might have a manager that's not had a sort of an explicit diagnosis, or maybe hasn't shared it with others? And how can they get the best out of that relationship? Because they have to manage the relationship, don't they?
Yeah, of course. It's a really great question. So you're right. You know, this is about 20% of us being neurodivergent. So 20% of all of us. So 20% of our managers, of our leaders, of board members, of people within our team. So you're absolutely right. This isn't exclusively just stopping at team level. I think the most important thing is to firstly recognize not everyone is going to have a diagnosis, as you've quite rightly said, Garen. The other thing from some research that we have done in conjunction with City and Guild, so we've run the Neurodiversity Index report for the last 3 years, and it has given us some really useful insights into what's going on for neurodiverse talent within organisations, etc., and how we can really look at that and take the learnings from it. One of the key stats that's come from that is telling us that 72% of those who are neurodivergent and know they're neurodivergent are not going to tell you. And they're not going to tell you because they're worried about the impact that this is going to have on their career. And I would really love to say, oh, don't be silly, it's all fine. But of course, we know that that's not the case. And we know from some more recent polling, actually, that this has just got a bit worse. And it's got worse since the introduction of Donald Trump's executive orders around diversity and inclusion, and also since his friend Nigel Farage further reinforced it when he said, if you work in EDI in one of the councils that I'm now in control of, start looking for a new job because I'm coming for you. I think that was pretty verbatim what he said. And, you know, that's just made people even more cautious about talking about neurodiversity in the workplace. Certainly disclosure is not a word I'm particularly fond of because it sounds like you've got to open yourself up, tell very personal details about yourself. What it means is that actually collectively, whether you're team manager or team member, having a good understanding about just the different ways in which we do things in teams is really key and critical here. So getting to a point, so if I am answering your question, Garen, if you are a team member who has a team manager who you think may be neurodivergent and it's causing some difficulties across the team in some way, then thinking about how do we come together as a team to recognize differences and to be able to go through a session that helps us to understand, so for example, different ways in which we communicate. And so we run at Do It, we run some sessions to help with that. We use the Do It profiler for that, to look at different ways in which individuals might be communicating and then talking about that in teams. And of course, you have other tools that help that, you know, other people might be using within teams as well. But obviously, I'm going to talk about the neurodiversity based one. But understanding and appreciating difference is really important. And if we can do that in a team setting, I think that's really valuable, regardless of whether you're a team member or a team manager.
Another fairly specific question. So we spend a lot of our life in workshops, be it online or face to face, and a lot of the people on the in our audience will do as well. What would you say about kind of those team away days, those team offsites, those workshops? How can we make those better for everyone, I guess? What are some of the things we should be thinking about when we're designing those?
Great question,
or less worse.
Yeah. Great question. So, you know, first of all, let's start off with the premise that not all of us are going to love coming to a massive venue with bright lights and someone on a stage. You know, some of us are not going to love being on the stage. You know, all of these types of things. Just, we are all different, right? That's what the whole basis of neurodiversity is. Our brains are different. And so when you're designing a team event or some kind of away day, or you're delivering training, just have that in mind, that you're going to have different ways of communicating, of learning, of taking information in, including the processing time for information. And also, you know, you're going to have different sensory challenges, particularly in neurodivergence, that are going to play out. So think about the lighting, the noise, the way in which you've got your seating set up. Think about having quiet spaces that people can go to or work in as well, where places people can go and kind of debrief a bit during the day as well. If you're running stuff online, think about the options for having cameras off. And I know some people are like, no, definitely, if I'm running something online, I need to be able to see your face. Someone the other day was talking about they had got a speeding fine and they had to do one of these police sessions. And the rule was you were not allowed to turn your camera off at all during the, I don't know how long it was, the hours that you had to be on there, because the person needed to see that you were fully engaged and interacting. Now, for some, that's not just difficult, that's physically painful. And it wasn't until I'd really understood a bit more, actually, it was with my son. So, you know, he was diagnosed when he was 10. And before he was diagnosed, we were like in a big family. And I was always trying to encourage him to go to, you know, the family do and, you know, whatever it may be. This was hell on earth for him, actually, and I didn't realize it until much later. Equally, things like kids' birthday parties were just like, ugh. And he told me when he was a bit older, he said, Mum, it physically hurts me when my cousin screams. It's physically painful. And I hadn't appreciated that. And why would we? If we're not experiencing it ourselves, we might not appreciate that. So, but what we can do if we have knowledge is we can say, actually, you know what, having, you know, quiet spaces or thinking about the lighting and things like smells as well, that can be really triggering for some people. If you've got, like, you know, perfumes and things going on in rooms, and yeah, that can be really tricky for people too. So think about your environment, the ways in which people are presenting. I know at the CIPD conference last year, I was really delighted because they've introduced headphones for the stages that you were going to, whereas I think a couple of years before it was like, oh God, even I was like, this is too much, you know, noise coming at you from 6 stages and you're trying to sort of tune into the one that you're at, and it was really tricky. So if you're doing a big event like that, think about the ways in which people are receiving information, what information they're receiving. Can they see screens? Can you give people information in advance, or give them options to have information or slides in advance too? So at Do It Solutions, when we're running training sessions, we give people the options to receive all of our slides in advance so that they can see them And some people really like that, so that they're prepared, they're able to process information, they know what to expect. So there are lots of different options, and we've got some information on neuro-inclusive events that I can send to you so that you can share it in the show notes, if that would be helpful too.
Critique this if I'm incorrect, but about transitions and context shifting as well. So just staying with the topic, letting people go deeper on it and then slowly transitioning into something else because of processing.
Yeah, that's really important. And it's, that transitioning from, we'll talk about transitioning more generally as well, but also processing information when you're transitioning in meetings, etc., is really important. And that, that notion of we're all up to speed because two people in the room are up to speed. So, they're the two people I know, they're the ones I like. Yep, you've got it. Great, move on. Having to be alert to where everybody is, and also be alert to the fact that we're probably going to mask in that meeting, because what we don't want to do is to be the only one that says, oh no, I'm not quite ready, or I haven't quite got that. So you're likely going to go, yep, I've got it. So actually having an opportunity for people to check back in, or there was a really lovely sort of trend that came up a few years ago that I really liked, which said that we're going to have a cooling off period after every meeting. We're going to come to an initial decision, but we're going to have a 24-hour cooling off period where we have a chance to reflect and to come back to say whether we really agree that that's the decision. Because that processing, I think, is really critical. And of course, that's not always going to be possible, but it's also important to be conscious of that. And just on the theme of transitioning, Garen, while you were talking about it, because, of course, transitioning can also be if you're transitioning to new jobs, or you're transitioning to new projects, or to new workplaces, or new line managers. All of these things, changes, can be really tricky for some. So making sure that you are giving sufficient information and also sufficient time and support for transitions to happen, whatever those transitions might look like, I think is really, really important. And you just reminded me of, we're just about to go into a new school year, and I used to be able to put my calendar by the third week in September, when I would get a call from school to say, yeah, your son's not really settling. And this was before I had any inkling of any neurodivergence. And of course, that all makes perfect sense now. Preparing for transition and for change, giving enough information, showing, if, for example, in our OD projects, if we're changing departmentally, or we're changing location, or whatever the case may be, giving as much information as you can about the change, what it looks like physically, giving people opportunities to look at it, to touch it, to feel it, is going to be really critical too, to enable that transition to go really smoothly.
Actually, that's just good practice, isn't it?
I'm quickly coming to the conclusion. This is all good.
Isn't it? Right?
This isn't about everyone. Yeah.
Precisely. This isn't about them. This is about all of us, because we are all neurodiverse. You're absolutely right.
So a more general question, what do you enjoy most about the work that you do?
Oh gosh. The difference that it makes. What I absolutely love is when people give me feedback that they've learned something new. Actually, I tend to do a bit of a poll at the end saying, is everyone leaving with a new piece of information? Because that's just like my absolute mission, is that people have more information and knowledge about neurodiversity at the end of the session than when they first came in. And I'm delighted to say that everybody has. And I consistently reach that particular milestone. And that really is the thing that keeps me going. When I started talking about this and kind of offering my knowledge out to fellow HR professionals, I had a very selfish aim, which was that by the time my son entered the workplace, this was going to be a much more neuro-inclusive place for him. I haven't quite managed that, and I'll give you some insights into that, but definitely, I continue to add my voice to this conversation. And the more people I can talk to, the more people I can reach through just having these types of conversations means that more people have a higher level of awareness, and that's just brilliant.
And did you want to say more about your experience with your son?
Yeah, I think so my son decided rather belatedly, God love him, after his GCSEs that he would rather not go to college and that he'd like to start an apprenticeship, please, which was just perfect. And not just any apprenticeship, an apprenticeship in mechanical engineering, and nothing else would be suitable. So the reason why I say God love him is because he decided that at the end of his GCSEs, once the recruitment for all of the big firms who would be recruiting for mechanical engineering apprentices straight out of school at GCSE level had all been done like the year before. So we had a year, I called it his gap year because, why not? And I was helping him obviously significantly. Why wouldn't you? As a mum who is an HR professional, of course you're going to help him to get this stuff done. And it was a real eye opener because I just thought, yeah, neurodiversity, of course, we're all talking about it, not a problem. So what we'll do when you apply for it, let's say I'm neurodivergent. I never would say I'm autistic because, as I know now, he's not just one thing. He's brilliantly neurodivergent. So I'm neurodivergent. It would really help me if I could have the questions in advance. That was the kind of standard request that he had. The number of companies that came back and said no was pretty shocking, actually. And so me being me, could you explain why you said no to that? Oh, we asked the panel and they weren't comfortable with you having the questions in advance because if they gave them to you, that would be disadvantageous to all the other candidates, but then give them to everyone, not just to me. Give all of the candidates the questions. Oh, we couldn't do that because that wouldn't be the right way to be able to assess you. Okay. And do you know what his response was to that? I don't want to go, Mum. I don't want to go. That just, that you can't underestimate the level of anxiety that had really built up in him to the point where it's like, I'm not going to go. So, just doing something really simple like giving everyone the questions in advance is really opening up the ability for people to just feel prepared. None of us like interviews and having to think of stuff on the spot. Well, some of us might, but I certainly haven't met many people that do. But our interview processes are really geared around that, aren't they? And also the kind of the competency-based interview way of let's all sit around the table, fire questions at you, listen to your responses that have got to be really quick, and then that will tell me that you're really good at driving. Will it? You didn't test my driving. I just told you I'm good at it, but you haven't actually tested what I'm good at. So, I think, again, we've got to shift to skills-based assessments. We've got to think about how we're assessing. The difference when he was given the questions in advance was really stark. He'd sit there preparing. He was able then to present himself in a way that was cohesive, where he wasn't stumbling over stuff. And of course, as an interviewer, your skill is then in having follow-up questions. Giving questions in advance doesn't stop you asking follow-up questions and getting a good sense of the candidate's skills and experience, but it does help the candidate to feel ready in that type of situation. And there are loads of other ways you can help candidates or make your neuro-inclusive recruitment process. Things like giving information in advance of this is what the process is, here's where it's going to be held, this is how you get here. So I saw a really good example of someone filming themselves coming from the tube station in London. And when you come up the escalators, this is the exit that you want. When you come out of this exit, turn left. This is the way that you walk to our office. Here's our office. Our door's around the corner. So it's just around here. You go through this door, right? Took them 10 minutes to record that. And that can just be used for everyone who's ever going to visit their office. And for some who are neurodivergent, that's like, brilliant. Now I can be less nervous about where I'm going, and I know which way I'm going because I've got that video. So tell people what to expect, where to go, and also the types of assessment that you're going to be carrying out. Because that was one of the other things that he experienced was, please come to this interview. And when he got there, it was actually an assessment centre. And the first part of the assessment centre was for him to do a presentation to all of the other candidates and the people that were assessing. And he said, Mum, I nearly left and nearly went over and said, this isn't for me. And I could see why. And, the irony of that as well is that that was for an apprentice who was going to be an electrician. And I said, if I ask my electrician to do me a bit of a presentation, I can imagine the expletives that would have been coming back. So, thinking about the suitability and the requirements of the assessment are also really key.
So I guess one of the things I'm wondering here is, because we can easily say, I want to change the culture of my organisation to make it more inclusive, but culture's like an emergent property of all the rules and explicit and implicit rules within an organisation. And, you just picked out one small element of their process, which, can quickly sort of guide the type of candidates that come into their organisation and make it, exclusive to people that may be neurodivergent. So how do you look at your organisation through fresh eyes? How do you sort of take a step back? Because not everyone can send their son through a recruitment process to identify all the problems that are wrong with it. Oh, that's a great idea. Because many people have been with their organisations for so years. You're institutionalised. You're blind to what goes on. How do you make people aware of the water in which they're swimming?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think if you are the sort of organisation that is curious enough to want to look at your processes, your culture through different eyes, then bring people in who can do that for you, right? So we don't have to be experts in everything, but there are experts who can help you with that stuff. And of course, we at Do It Solutions, we can help you with looking at a gap analysis. So where are you now? What does best practice look like? And therefore, what might you do to be able to get there? And that's a really straightforward way of looking at the way in which you can move towards neuro-inclusivity. And that's not saying that you've got to have it all done overnight, but it does mean you're showing that you want to be able to make a difference. And there are organizations like the Business Disability Forum, the CIPD have got some great resources as well. We Do It, we share loads of stuff regularly because, of course, our whole mission is about increasing awareness of neurodiversity. So there is information out there. It doesn't have to be something that you bring people in to do, but if you've got someone in the business who is really committed to doing this, then I think it's a really great starting point and moving from there. A lot of the time, having a senior buy-in is really vital and can really help to get you some traction, and also having a bit of budget behind you as well can be helpful. So speaking to the key sponsors or to your finance team, etc., to help to fund some of this stuff also shows great commitment to actually making stuff move.
Yeah, so when you look at the kind of field you're working, what's particularly interesting you at the moment in terms of developments and areas of interest?
Yeah, I think the biggest sort of area of interest at the moment is this real shift towards looking at neuro-inclusivity throughout the employee life cycle. So I think what we're realizing now is that neuro-inclusion isn't just about getting your recruitment practices right. It's also about looking at barriers that might exist throughout your employee life cycles. So thinking about your onboarding process, thinking about development, what are the barriers that are stopping people from developing within your organization, and accessing things like additional information or additional support, and to enable that development to happen. Also conversations around things like performance management, that as we spoke earlier, that notion that if someone is neurodivergent, you can't possibly have a formal performance management process if someone's falling short. Well, of course you can, but you have to ensure that you've looked at how we're supporting them or what their particular challenges might be, and that you show that you've taken those things into consideration as well. So I think what I'm really enjoying is the fact that the conversation's really increased and people are talking about neurodiversity a lot more. And what I would encourage people to do is to continue to do that, but also really listen to those people who are experts in the space when we're thinking about how we're implementing it in our workplace. Because, somebody who's just talking about autism is really not talking about neurodiversity in the complete way that we should have a real understanding and appreciation, I would say.
So Mel, what's one of the biggest lessons that you've learned along the way that you'd like to share with others?
The biggest lesson I've learned is that we all have a brilliantly unique brain, which I know I've said throughout, but when I look back over my career, and particularly when I was dealing with some tricky employee relations cases, I can now recognize that the individuals that I was dealing with at the time may have been neurodivergent. But what I applied was, this is what the policy says. The policy says we must do this next and we must do that next. And actually being much more personable and flexible around those types of ways in which we're supporting is really critical. So I think that's probably my biggest lesson is, having an open mind to what's going on, being curious, really curious. So if someone says, I've got ADHD, for example, asking the question, what does that tell me about you? And listening to what they say, actively listening. Also having this catch-all question, which I love, which is, please let me know what I can do to make this the best possible experience for you. And then using that at any stage of any process that we're doing. So we're recruiting for this position. Please let us know what we can do to make this the best possible experience for you. We're having a team meeting. Please let us know what we can do to make this the best possible experience. We're having an event. We are having some promotions. We're going to have to go through redundancies. All of these types of things. That question is so valuable at every stage of our employment life cycle and just life.
Fabulous. And then one question we like to ask, are there any particular books or podcasts or anything else that you'd recommend to other people?
Yeah, good question. So I would recommend a book that was written by Professor Amanda Kirby and Theo Smith, which is called Neurodiversity at Work. And it's a really brilliant, almost handbook of things to think about at each stage of the employment life cycle. And you can just have it as a reference guide to be able to use in workplaces. I wish every HR team, OD team had a copy for them to look at. So that's a really great book. And of course, I would recommend the OrgDev podcast for you to be able to listen to all types of different experts across the space. I can't think of a particular neurodiversity podcast at the moment.
Brilliant. And then last question from us. If someone's watching this and they're deciding, I really need to really understand better, neurodivergence and build it into my practice, what advice would you give them to sort of start that journey with really strong foundations?
So I would advise them to watch the very short video that I'm going to put in the show notes here, which is a 2.5-minute video, which gives an introduction to neurodiversity. So that video is called We're All Neurodiverse. And the kind of punchline on it, if you like, is, but we're not all neurodivergent. And it's a brilliant 2.5 minutes that gives you a really good introduction to neurodiversity, what it is and what it isn't, and then how we might apply that within our workspaces. And then take the principles from that and think about the way in which you're supporting team members. Have real consideration when you're going through the types of activities that you might need to within workplaces, and apply those principles of we're all neurodiverse.
Well, Mel, I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of Danny and I. It's been so useful, incredibly thought-provoking, educational, enlightening and insightful as well. So thank you. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
I've really enjoyed it. I think it's been really, really helpful. I think the audience are going to really enjoy listening to it. So I think some of the definition around neurodiversity and neurodivergence has been quite important, kind of bringing that to life and explaining that. And I think for me, one of the threads was just treating people as individuals and really seeking to understand the people we're working with and working for and working, who are working for us, and the importance of just knowing the people that we're with, and then just keeping that kind of curiosity and exploration around kind of what does that mean for you? What does that look like? How can we support? So yeah, there's some really practical ideas I think too weaved in there too.
Absolutely. And things I'm sort of taking away from it is, I love the phrases, what can I do to make this the best possible experience for you? And keep asking that at different stages on the way. I love the fact that a lot of what you're sharing is just good practice that all organizations would benefit from as well. And finally, just on a sort of a personal note, is like, for me, like you've made it it's really possible to talk about. Like of all the different podcasts we've ever done, this is probably one I was a little bit nervous about, because I was like, I want to get it right. I want to get the definitions right. But what you've kind of been able to do is create space where people can talk about it and find their way talking about it as well. So just a personal thank you for that as well. If people want to follow your brilliant work, if you want people to signpost them to the great work that you're doing, what's the best way for people to reach out to you and contact you?
Thank you. Best place is to find me on LinkedIn. So Melanie Francis, I think it's Melanie Francis Chartered FCIPD on LinkedIn. And also doitprofiler.com is the website for our organisation.
Well, I want to say a huge thank you, Mel. For one of the things we're always impressed with, the number of shares every week on this podcast. So if you're watching this podcast and you're thinking, my gosh, I really think someone would benefit from watching this. If there's ever been an interview to share, it's this one, because I think it'll be tremendously helpful. So please spread this interview far and wide. We're now at 84 countries, Danny, is that right?
85, I think, last count. So
great. We're at 85 countries. So wherever you are in the world, it is something that is going to be definitely impacting, the people around you as well. So please take the time to educate yourself on that as well. But please do reach out to Mel. She's a brilliant resource. It's always putting great content out there as well, so to keep your journey going as well. But most importantly, a huge thank you, Mel, for your time, and please keep up the amazing work. You're making such a big difference to the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.